How do we improve our communications with senior leaders and boards? Our guest today is Davina Stanley. She is the founder of Clarity First program, which helps C-suite executives and their teams to better engage senior leaders and boards in complex ideas. She is the author of 2 books, Elevate and Engage. And I've invited her here to talk to us about how to turn complex concepts into clear communication that makes a difference. And, if you're going to create transformation in the world, you got to be able to get your message across, get people to understand it and be able to action on it. And that's what her expertise is. So I'm excited to have her here. Davina, welcome to the Leaders of Transformation.
Thank you, Nicole. So great to have the opportunity to speak to you.
Likewise. So let's first of all, before we go any further, and I forget, I do want to do a shout out to the team at Oscar Hamilton. I always love to acknowledge those that support this show, and they are amazing. They have sent me some fantastic guests, and that's why we're having this conversation. And so thank you to them for making that introduction. We really appreciate it. So, yeah.
Definitely.
All right, let's talk about the biggest barriers to communication. I think that's a good place to begin.
Look, I think when we're talking about engaging senior leaders and boards, one of the biggest barriers is not understanding why we need to communicate with them. And I don't mean that in the general sense. I mean very specifically why we need to communicate at a particular point in time in a particular way. And I think very often people go to communicate about something they know a lot, sometimes too much about. And the temptation is just to give as much information as possible, because that way you've covered the gamut and it's really hard to be wrong. But what ends up happening is that the audience ends up doing all the filtering and the sorting of the ideas to try and work out what matters and what doesn't. So I think having a very, very clear strategic view of the outcome you want for that conversation, that paper, that meeting, that whatever it is essential. And it's something that people often skip over. They just jump to writing. If they're talking, if it's a formal communication, they jump to speaking or jump to writing. And I think that can be a real problem.
Yes. Yes. I mean, I think about the number of presentations I've seen, people like preparation materials for presentations. And, it's all about, and I did this too, like in the beginning, it's like, yeah, but I need to talk about this and I need to talk about that. And I need to talk about this. And it's like, well, do I though? I mean, if my point is this, these are great stories or great examples or data points, but I don't need all of them necessarily to drive home the point. And some of us are over explainers, I think. So there is that. Yeah.
Yeah, it can be. And, when you are speaking with senior people too, sometimes you feel a little nervous. Maybe you don't know them very well, or you're not really clear of their expectations, or perhaps they're so far removed from your day-to-day. It's very hard to see them as human beings as well. And, maybe they're a tough board or a tough set of leaders and they challenge you. So it's easy to go in with a bit of nervousness, which I think then makes people say too much and often too quickly as well. But the way you said that was quite interesting, because what you were doing was carving back the I want to. When we think about, well, I want to update the board, let's say, that's all very well, but why? What's the outcome? What are they getting from this? And I think to filter out those stories, thinking about your audience is absolutely essential. But then if your manager doesn't help you understand those, how do you do that? That's quite challenging.
Yes. So talk about your process. And I know that in that we also talked about, when we talked previously, about the fact that leaders are actually spending a lot of time rewriting. So speak to that as well.
Yes. I think one of the things we see happening quite a lot is that leaders end up reviewing papers and presentations quite late when they become urgent, which is understandable. And that happens for a few reasons. But one of the main ones, I think, is that they'll receive a draft from their team and they'll look at it and say, right, I can see there's a lot of good work gone into this. There's a lot of good ideas. I'm sure all the information's here, but I need a solid block of time to review it and to do it justice, to do the effort that my team has put in justice. I don't want to just tick and flick. I want to be substantive in my response. And so when that happens, the leader gets that paper and thinks, right, that's due in 10 days' time. What does my diary look between now and then? Wow, it's jammed. Okay, so I've got to squeeze this in somewhere. How do I find a block of time that's more than 30 minutes to do this justice? And what ends up happening is they leave it until it becomes really urgent, which is understandable. But then what happens is that they can't find a big enough block of time during their day. So it happens at nights and weekends. And what happens then is when they're in the middle of reviewing, it's too late to get their team to help. It's too late to ask those clarification questions of their team. It's too late to brief them properly because maybe they realize in the moment they gave them a really shallow briefing in the beginning, which is why this is a kitchen sink. It's got lots of things in it, but it's not actually pointing in any direction. And so they tend to end up reworking it themselves because they've wedged themselves in a corner. They actually have very little choice at that point, but to rewrite it themselves. And that has a whole lot of flow-on consequences because it means that they're doing their team's job for them. But it also means that once this has happened a few times, the team expects it to happen. And so their method can often be, well, I'll give them everything that they might need to write the paper rather than writing the paper, because they don't know what's required. And so if they just give their boss a whole lot of information, their boss is going to do it anyway. So why would they spend their time doing it? They'll go do something else. So it's very easy to create a very unhealthy dynamic around these sorts of papers where they become quite a burden.
Well, I can think about if a leader is doing that, and like you said, they're just like, okay, I'm going to give them all the information. There's really two audiences, right? So they're actually writing for the CEO as the audience versus the end reader, which is like the board or whoever that they're actually meant to be writing for. So it becomes very different in that process. Yeah.
It does. And I think too, when they're, writing for the CEO in that scenario, they're actually not even doing that. They're not saying, hey, CEO, here's why this idea is a terrific one, why we should invest this money, why it's true that we're performing really well across all our metrics or whatever the message is. They're actually saying, here's all the stuff, CEO, that you might need so that you can write.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So it's not even saying, hey, CEO, here's the good idea. It's, hey, CEO, here's the stuff.
Here's the stuff. Yeah.
Mm.
It's I think everybody can relate to getting to the last minute, whether you're having to write it yourself for yourself, or you're writing it for someone else, or you've been tasked to do that. You get to that last minute. Sometimes brilliance can come out. I'm sure you have had that experience where it's like, okay, I'm presenting this tomorrow, and you figure it out, and it's amazing. But when you're talking about the level of detail and facts and data that needs to be put in, that's a whole different ballgame and a whole different set of consequences if it's not done right. So once it's published. So let's talk about the model that you recommend. And I love in your book where you talk about that one-page message template.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So talk about that.
Yep, absolutely. So everything that we do in helping people prepare their messaging for, let's say, a senior audience is anchored around a single page. And it's a very structured page where you organize your ideas using a technique called structured thinking that comes out of management consulting. It comes out of McKinsey. And the way that we think about it is, well, how do we set our team up to land their messaging on that single page very, very quickly, so that instead of the leader being given that whole page, that whole document to review, they're given a one-pager that they can review in, let's say, 15 minutes and give some really substantive commentary on and be very helpful very quickly. So you remove that barrier of, oh my gosh, this is going to take ages. And the way we do that is to set a process in play. So there's two tracks. There's the leaders track and then the contributors track. And we'll talk from the leader's perspective for the moment. But so the leader, first of all, will ready the team and help them work out what's really required for this paper. What's the outcome that we really want? And that should be a conversation. If it's something that is fairly routine or not very contentious, it can be quite quick. It doesn't have to be onerous, but it kickstarts the process, the thinking process really early. And I think people often leave that because they're just not sure themselves as leaders. What do we really want from this? They haven't really thought about it. And so the trick is to empower your team to ask you some really good questions, to help flush that out really early on and take a good stab at what you think the outcome should be. And by doing it early, you're allowing time so that, when you're walking the dog or you're having a shower or whatever, ideas occur to you and your thinking matures quite naturally. It doesn't take a lot of effort. It just happens. And it's like, oh, there's that great idea. And so what you're doing is allowing what's called diffuse thinking to happen for you and your team by giving yourselves a bit of time to prepare the thinking. So kick it off by getting everybody ready. Then the team might go away and they might prepare their message map, their one pager. They'll think through the communication strategy some more, which should be part of the briefing conversation. Who's your audience? What are we going to achieve? Then you map out a draft of that one pager. And we've got patterns to help people do that and some things that they can use to make it easier. So they map out that one page and then flick that up to the leader to say, okay, what do you think? Have we nailed it? Is the messaging on point? And, one of my favorite clients at the moment said to me, oh, do you mean all I need to do is get a stack of these a week before they're due from, everyone in the team that's got a pitch to the board or the leadership team? I can get a batch of them, maybe 15 minutes each, get my pen out, make some notes, send them off. If they're in bad shape, I can maybe have a call and say, hey, go again. But for the most part, I'll be able to make some comments on it quite quickly and send it back. That's all I need to do. Yeah, that's all you need to do. So that process, you might go up once, you might go up twice to iterate around that message map. And that message map has a really short introduction with two very specific elements to it. It has one single overarching message that's 25 words or less. And then it has the supporting ideas organized in a particular way, in a hierarchy, using inductive logic or deductive logic. We have two different ways we structure them. And that structuring becomes a bit like a thinking machine to pull out the ideas and tease them out. So you just make sure everybody knows how to drive that. You've got that one page, you get that signed off. And once that's signed off, then it's really easy to write the paper because you're taking the words literally from that one pager, putting them into the board template and saying, okay, well, here's what we've got to say, and maybe adding some more layers of detail, adding some appendix, maybe some extra things. But there's a one-for-one correlation between the message map and the document, whether it's prose or PowerPoint. So once that happens, then, it's fairly easy for the leader to actually deliver. It's very often not the author of the paper who's delivering it. It's very often somebody else. So, make the presentation, but then come back at the very end and make sure you embed the learnings. And again, it doesn't have to be a big conversation, but it's really easy to forget to reflect on what did we learn about our stakeholder group through this conversation? Has their thinking shifted on this issue? Have they changed their view on anything? Did we miss something? Did we manage our process really well? Or did the leader end up rewriting the thing at the last minute or big portions of it? Was the briefing really high quality? So we don't want to go through some enormously difficult post-implementation review on every paper we do, but we want to have a quick conversation and just capture the big learnings from it. So we really embed it and create a bit of a flywheel effect so that we can take those learnings and then feed them back in to the next one to reduce the difficulty or the challenge perhaps around that initial briefing. So it's about seeing, I think, that board paper process as a bit of a project, mini project, and being a
Yes.
bit structured about it.
Well, I also think about it as being a way that you can actually develop leaders and improve communication skills within your organization. Because let's say the first time you do it with somebody, it might not be that good. They may need to do a little reworking. Second time, maybe not as much. And after a while, they've done a number of these, they're going to get better at it. They're going to figure out how this tool works so that they can actually produce higher quality results, even on the first round of it for the CEO, or ask better questions so that they get better answers to help them to do it. And you're breaking it down into bite-sized pieces. So it's not like, I'm not a good writer, or I can't do these papers. And it's very globalized to this project and seeing this project as one big thing, but you're actually breaking it down into sections and saying, it's like mastery, right? Master the parts, you master the relationships between the parts, and that's how you master the whole. And so you're actually teaching them how to do that. And I see this actually applicable to, I think about marketing. This is the same process that you would go through for a marketing message of any type, right? If somebody has a business and they want to put their message out there, okay, who is our audience? It's the Simon Sinek, right? Start with the why.
Oh, yes.
Right?
Oh, yes. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's the same thing. It's just you actually created a framework around, okay, what does that actually look like when you're creating a presentation or a paper?
Correct. And, within those papers, within those message maps, when I think about what people find the hardest, it is the why as well. They often assume, we don't need to explain why this particular thing that we want to do really matters. They know that. Or they might say, well, we don't need to explain why each one of these actions are the right actions. We don't need to convince them of that. We're the experts. We just say, here's how you do it. But even if they accept that they do need to explain why, they find it very hard to do.
Why is that?
I think because it requires synthesis. It requires us to tease out our assumptions about why we do things. When you're an expert at something, you don't have to explain to yourself why you've designed your data security framework the way you have. This is just the way you think it should be done. And so it requires you to go back a bit to first principles and really connect whatever it is you're proposing with the strategy and to explain the connection. And that can be uncomfortable because it means you've got to justify your own thinking. It puts you in the hot seat a bit. It's quite hard. I consistently see that to being the hardest piece, to build the case, to build your reasoning for something.
So how did you get into this? I mean, this is talk about niches. This is a very niche service that you provide.
It is. And it's something that's evolved over time too. I've had my own practice in broadly this area for quite some time now. I think I don't know. I started learning the ideas in the mid-1990s. I've had my own practice, communication practice before that, but I joined McKinsey in the mid-90s and learned this structured thinking toolkit. And I really found it at first incredibly difficult, but in a way that was really interesting. It's like, okay, this is a real challenge. How do I actually do this and do this really well? Like mechanically to do it's not that hard, but to be insightful, not just well structured in your thinking, but insightful about it, it's actually very difficult. So I saw it as a really great challenge. And I had the opportunity to work with terrific people during that period. I freelanced for the firm for quite some time as a traveling mum. We were quite nomadic as a family. So I just kept it going like that for a while. But then started working in corporate and started seeing the opportunities for applying these consulting skills into a corporate environment and the differences and the ambiguity that exists in those environments. So I think I've just evolved over time with hopefully the needs of my clients and trying to answer their questions and in the spirit of being helpful. And when you're running a training business and you're training broadly the same toolkit for, golly, that's coming up 30 years, isn't it? It's a long time now. It could get very dull, truly. It's the same toolkit. So how do you make it interesting? Well, you find client problems and how do I apply this to those problems? And the board communication, senior leaders and board communication is something that's very hard for a lot of people. It's a big step up for a lot of people. And so they're interested in getting better at it. But also, complexity. People tend to come to me when they've got complex things that they need to communicate. And I find that really interesting because I get to learn such a lot when I'm helping them about their discipline. So I think it's just been a natural journey through trying to help more people in ways that's genuinely useful to them.
Yeah. So I was thinking like the framework is the same, but the content is different all the time. And that makes it interesting.
And
I
the
have to say
people.
it's kind of like podcasting. I've been podcasting for a while and it's the same process each time, but it's different guests and different conversations that we're having. And some are, focused on leadership or some are focused on, whatever, right? It's just different. And that's what makes it interesting. And it's actually an interesting point too, to add in here is that, for a little side note for listeners who are wondering, like we have a lot of different topics on here. The reason why I do that is for that reason. It's because if I'm talking about the same topic every week, I can't bring my best to that. Like after a while, it gets dull for me.
You need variety.
And then, yes. And so as a host, I need variety so that I can keep it interesting, as well, and be interested, demonstrate interest in it. So, yeah.
Yeah.
And as simple as and obvious as that sounds, how many business owners are doing the same thing over and over again and getting bored with it? And so then they jump to something completely different. And then they wonder why they're not getting the gains, if you will, because they're constantly trying to start something new and they're not seeing the fruition, the harvest of all of the effort because they've gone on to something different. So there's something in there about being able to keep it interesting and keep your attention.
Yes. And honestly, when I started making training the main focus of what I was doing, it was back in what in Australia we called the Great Financial Crisis. I think you called it maybe the Great Recession here in the States in about 2009. And I was working with some people who had brought me in because of this structured thinking toolkit, and they had wanted to represent Barbara Minto in Australia, who's the founder of the method, and I helped them with that. So I'd been working with them on that process, but then the deal didn't go through and the work dried up on a few fronts. And they said, okay, well, how about you partner up with somebody else that we know, and he needs to help go and teach a whole lot of lawyers, and so why don't you do that for a while and then come back to us? I thought, well, that's a great plan, because I think the training thing will be fun for a while, but actually it's going to get a bit repetitive, and I actually said, look, I can't see myself doing this for all that long because I think I'll just get really bored. But it's been quite the opposite. I've been really pleasantly surprised, that's quite some time ago now. But just finding how interesting it can become to try and work out how to really help people the most in the least time. How to maximize the impact of what I do in the way I ask questions, the way I engage with people, the ideas that I share, the ways in which I can be sometimes general or sometimes very, very deep, and where to go, which way, how to deliver it so that I'm not bored, by recording some of the things that are really repetitive, and actually how that turns out that is actually better from an outcome standpoint, where people get to learn some things and come together and do some things. Because when you're doing the things with people, you're on your toes 100%. It's fabulous. It's draining, but you're right in there with them, showing them, doing with them, teaching them at the same time.
Yeah.
And so I'm very fortunate to have this opportunity to do what I do. I think I'm very lucky.
Yeah. So I want to talk about your books, but just while we're talking about this, when you were talking, you mentioned about, it's like, hey, why don't you come and do this for a little while? You have a lot of consulting expertise. Do you ever find yourself being asked to kind of go, and it's kind of like the same thing as when you're talking about doing these papers, right? You got to stay focused on the thing, right? Stay focused on the why. But do you have ever where you, because you have expertise, that you might be working with someone on this particular project and you're seeing all these other things that need to be addressed? Do you ever feel like you want to wander out there and, they need some help over here, maybe I'll help them here? And I don't know if you ever do that or not, but I know it's a common issue for consultants that kind of get, then they end up doing
Right.
everything, for trying to be everything to everyone.
Yes. Okay. So I think my engagements are almost always very clearly defined to build skill. So the way that I might help somebody in that regard is to, when they're thinking about what their messaging might be around, addressing a problem, it would be to incorporate that kind of observation in that messaging.
Yes.
And to help them work out, well, what is the most effective message for this moment? How will you convey or get this outcome that you need? So if you're thinking about your stakeholders and you've worked out that Fred Bloggs, who's the operations manager, is going to be the key person that you've really got to get across the line, and Fred Bloggs, you suspect, really doesn't like the idea that you want to put forward, what are you going to do about that? How are you going to solve that? Do you understand why he might be against the idea that you've got or the recommendation that you've got? Is it something to do with his history and things he's seen before? Is it his hot buttons, personal hot buttons? Is it something else? What is it? And so you end up solving business problems by working out that sort of thing, as well as then, okay, once we've understood the dynamics with you and Fred around this issue, does that mean you need a side conversation? What do you need to say? How are you going to handle that? Do you need to get someone else to intervene for you before you get to the board? How do you handle all of that? So there's such a lot of problem solving in the middle of what I do. I might suggest to somebody there's something that they might think about, but I don't expand my scope beyond the training.
Yeah. So it's like staying within the bucket of, and I think that's important. I think there's a lesson there because, like I said, there's a lot of consultants. I've had a lot of consultants on this show. I've had a lot of consultants pitch me on being on this show. And when they'll say, hey, here are all the topics that I can talk about, it literally covers all of it, right? I didn't talk about anything, which, to be fair, many of them can because they have experience in all those areas. It's like, I can talk about whatever, just I'll show up and ask me whatever. And what you're doing is so specific and you are getting known for that very specific thing. And you've been doing it for 30 years as that. So there is something to be said for that specificity. And as I said, from a principle standpoint, that is the same principle that you're applying in the development of these papers and presentations. And I just wanted to kind of show how that actually applies as well. So really good. Let's talk about your books.
Yes, because I think that is in some ways where I've expanded the scope a little this time, where I've got 2 books coming out at once, and one is ready to come out, one will be out very soon. But they're a pair, and when we spoke about the process around the board papers, around the leader's role and the team member's role. So I've got a book for leaders, which is the first one that comes out to help set people up to coach their teams and so on around this. And then one for the team members who might be in the trenches doing a lot of the heavy lifting around writing and thinking around the messaging and so on. And so if there's any stretch there outside scope, it's not so much breadth that's going up and saying, okay, well, how do we think about this from a leadership standpoint? And so I was asked some really great questions from an old colleague of mine. And it's funny how a few little questions over a long period of time have just stuck in the back of my mind. And his question to me was, so how do we actually make them do this? How do we actually get them to do this? I thought, well, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about it like that. And, we're talking 15 years ago now that he asked me that question. So it's been a long marination, but it's like, okay, all right. So there is a leadership question here. And what does that look like? And how do we persuade them? But also, how do we help them? And so I thought, well, whenever you are preparing a paper, it's a collaborative effort. Everybody has a role. And so what if we think about it from the different perspectives? broadly of the people in that situation. You've got your leaders, and then you've got the people who are contributing to the paper as well, the ones commissioning it, the ones who are delivering it, if you like. And so that's been the stretch. That's been a wonderful journey to really think that through. So Elevate is the new book for leaders, which is literally off right today to the publisher, the final version that we've been talking about. And the next book is almost done. It's got a little bit more work to be done, but it's quite close. That's called Engage. So
Yeah. That's good. That's good. Yeah. I was thinking about how this applies to other things, right? So, because it's so applicable. And I think about even as a business, somebody is creating a business plan. So I'm kind of giving these ideas as well so people can think about, wow, I could use it for this. Because as I was reading your book, I was thinking this is a great model for putting a business plan together because it's a paper, right? It's literally,
Yeah.
and so to focus in and saying, why are we here? It's the same thing that I've asked clients who say, I want to increase sales and do all the things. And so, okay, great. I want to grow my business. Great. So why are you in business? What is the purpose of this business? Who are you serving? And it's the same questions, and to your point about how do we get them to do this? It's funny because, you can talk strategy and you can teach skills all day. What's the mindset that they need to have that will allow them? What beliefs do they need to have to even value this and or believe that they can do it? And so there's all of those things. So yeah, but staying focused in the midst of all of that, staying focused on your expertise, going a little bit, like you said, maybe, vertical or whatever, going up with that in the depth of it. And, but staying really focused on that, even in the midst of that. So there's some great lessons there for content creators, trainers, consultants to be able to stay. How do you stay focused on keep the main thing in the midst of all of that? Yeah.
Yeah.
It's good.
And it is interesting to me how it can stay so interesting to do that also.
Mm-hmm.
And just, I think somebody said to my kids once, actually, it was a principal of a school, and he was talking about boys. And he said, look, what we try to do is make sure that they are interested, so they become interesting. And I've had the great fortune to be interested in what I'm doing from the human side, because I love seeing the difference it makes. When I hear somebody say to me, oh, I've been asked the other day why it is that every paper I put forward gets approved first go. It's like, wow, that's a great business outcome, but it's also just very satisfying for that person. Or why somebody who's spending 24 hours every weekend rewriting their team's papers is not doing that anymore. And it turns out that person's got a 2-year-old and a 6-month-old. You think, wow, that is really, really interesting to me.
Yeah.
That's really motivating.
And that's transformative because you're actually transforming the caliber of the communication. You're also transforming the team and the way they interact. You're transforming the lives of the leaders. So they're not spending weekends. That's why I was interested, because, we talk a lot about transformation, even though it's leadership, but it's transformation. It's how are you creating transformation in the world? And I saw that as you were describing what you do. I was like, oh, wow. Yeah, this is something we need to talk about. It's unique. It's different. I haven't had anybody on the show that has talked about this specific thing, how to write great board papers or presentations, but it's been really, really interesting. And as I said, there's so many applications to it beyond even just that. So it's good. It's good. So we'll make sure that links to your books are going to be in the show notes, the one that's going to be released.
Yep.
And then once your other one is released, we'll make sure we'll add that to the show notes, even for those that are listening to this years in advance in the future. And I know you also have a boot camp as well.
Yeah. Yes, the board paper boot camp. Yes, the next one is coming up in just under a month, actually.
Okay.
It's half full at the moment, so I only take 15 people at a time. Mm-hmm. take them through the process that we're working with to learn, and through building a paper of their own. That's the journey that I take them on.
Right.
And look, it's been a wonderful thing to do, and it's lovely to do it to a public cohort where you've got a real mix of people from a mix of backgrounds coming in. So you get some really great discussions in that session as well. So it's called the Board Paper Bootcamp.
Awesome. Well, we'll make sure there's a link in the show notes to that information, as well as your website, clarityfirstprogram.com, and your LinkedIn. So if people want to reach out to you there, we'll make sure that's all in the show notes. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming and sharing a little bit with us on this. And I highly recommend that our guests, that our audience actually get a copy of your books, because I got a lot out of it. And I know that it's just frameworks like this make our life that much easier, because we can plug information in, and it just causes us to focus our thinking to be more effective and efficient in that. So highly recommend both of those books when they come out. And so again, thank you so much for being here, and thank you to our listeners for being here as well. And we just hope this has been valuable to you. Perhaps, I always say leaders of transformation take action. Perhaps it's maybe revisiting that last paper and looking at that as almost like a learning lesson. If I were to plug that information in to this model, how would I have changed it, or how could I improve upon it, versus waiting into that next paper until you're the weekend before and you're trying to figure out how to do it. Now you're scrambling and saying, how do I learn from past experiences? Take action on the information that you're listening, that you're learning here today, so that you can actually be better. And when you're ready, when you need to do that paper, or maybe it's, you're going to delegate that paper to someone, you're a lot more prepared to do it at that point. And so, and maybe maybe none of this is like having the need to do board papers isn't part of your repertoire or whatever, your requirements. But maybe you have a business and you look at your marketing. I would plug in their marketing. I would plug in their business plan. How can you bring more clarity to the message that you're putting out there into the world? And I know that you're going to see a huge difference as you do that. So we can all learn to get better at that, myself included. So anyway, thank you for joining us here today. And we look forward to seeing you next week on another episode of the Leaders Transformation.